Welcome to the church library. Draw up a chair and join us as we sort through these stacks of old books. I'm Marissa Burt.
And I'm Kelsey McGinnis. And here in the church library, we host conversations about popular Christian books. This season, we are dusting off Christian parenting resources.
Our book, The Myth of Good Christian Parenting, How False Promises Betrayed a Generation of Evangelical Families, examines many of these books, the obscure, the bestsellers, the ones that still pop up in church parenting classes.
Let's see what's on the bookshelves today. Hi, Marissa.
Hi, Kelsey. Good to see you in the church library today.
Good to see you in the church library. Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Yeah. Here we are, middle of summer. Is it hitting you guys? How's it going?
Yeah, we just got out of the heat wave thing that was over the Midwest. So listeners, I'm not sure what week you're listening to this, but the day we're recording is sort of like the end of the heat wave. We've been, mid 90s.
Oh my goodness.
At least 4 or 5 days. But it's like weird because it's like also very windy. So it's been the strangest kind of weather, but yeah, just like too hot to do much outside and also very windy and just a lot uncomfortable weather, I would say.
Yeah, uncomfortable. You're feeling it. Yeah. Well, we just passed longest day, right? Solstice. And out here in the summer, that means sun's out till like 10 p.m. So it is amazing, lovely long days, but it means everyone's up very late. And small children don't necessarily sleep in. So it's just, summer.
Oh my goodness.
Long days of summer.
We let all three of ours stay awake to watch fireflies because we back up.
Oh, that's sweet.
So we get lots of fireflies this time of year, right at dusk. So like around between like 9 and 9:30.
Yeah.
And it like never fails. We let them stay up and I have to mentally prepare myself. Like they will be up at 6 the next morning. It does not matter.
It does not matter.
I have early risers. Our neighbors down the street, one of my kids went to go see if they could play at like 9 a.m. a couple days ago and their kids were like just waking up. And I cannot imagine. I cannot imagine what that is like.
This hasn't come for you yet.
No. None of the three have. They've always just been like 6:30, just awake.
Ready for the day, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. Yeah, that feels very summer to me. So yeah, we're soaking it up, but long days and almost July when we record this. So this is fun. We have a few more episodes left to do for this season. And today, what do we find on the shelves of the church library today?
Today, we are pulling off the shelves, I think, the newest book we have done, most recent anyway,
I think so.
Which is Parenting by Paul David Tripp. The full title is Parenting, 14 Gospel Principles That Can Radically Change Your Family. And if the name Paul David Tripp sounds vaguely familiar, but you feel like it's not completely familiar, you would be correct because Ted Tripp is the author of Shepherding a Child's Heart, one of the most popular evangelical parenting books of the 90s. Paul David Tripp is his brother.
Yes, they are brothers, and they both studied at Westminster. Paul David does he go by Paul David together? I'm not sure how to refer to him. He had his doctorate ministry there. We get asked about this one a lot. When I was doing the deep dive on Shepherding a Child's Heart, a lot of people would ask about, so I think some people are aware of the connection, or maybe mix the names up. Because I could see doing that if you just pull the same last name. So yeah, they're connected. I could not find anywhere them commenting on each other's work. Did you?
I've not seen that either. I have seen that they've done interviews together somewhere.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And I don't remember where, and I don't remember why I've seen that. But they aren't like estranged or anything.
Right.
But they aren't working on this together.
They've got separate ministry trajectories. Ted Tripp has kind of did his own publishing sphere, has produced a number of resources. But as I was reading this, and I'm less familiar with Paul David, I got the impression he's still doing a conference circuit to discuss parenting, kind of family life ministry. So yeah, it's interesting, and we'll talk about the ways the resources are similar and different as we go along. But yes, this is one we've gotten a lot of questions about. It comes with a lot of big name endorsements. I mean, Toby Mack, Ann Voskamp, Francis Chan, Gloria Furman, Webb Simpson, who's a professional golfer. That's the only one I didn't recognize, and Jacob Tam, an NFL tight end. So those are the only two I was like, oh, I don't know those endorsers because I'm not a sports person, but yeah, a lot of big name endorsements.
Yeah. Yeah.
Comes highly recommended.
It does. And it won, gosh, and I'm trying to remember, it won some awards. I do not remember what. I think it, like the Evangelical Press, it won an award from them. It was pretty well reviewed, I would say, by evangelical publications.
Yeah.
Paul David Tripp is pretty generally respected, I would say, still in evangelical circles. He's a sought after speaker. He, like his brother, has his own ministry, nonprofit organization called Paul Tripp Ministries, of which he is, I believe, the president still.
Okay.
So still very, very active. And I often get questions about this book. I know of several churches that have used it over the past 2 years in parenting classes and in small group ministries. It's often on the shelves of church bookstores and libraries. I actually twice have visited a church in the past year and seen it on like a display in the lobby. So it is, it is a pretty, at the moment, very respected resource, kind of a
very
resource
popular.
if parents come in and ask, we're new parents, what should we be reading? I think this is one that a lot of pastors can very easily say, here you go. Here is one that can help you out.
Yep.
So let's see. I think maybe a good place to start would be by saying, well, I'll ask you, Marissa, since we both sort of skimmed it this week. I think this was your first time reading this book, right?
It was, yeah. I was delighted that someone in my local Buy Nothing group posted it a couple weeks ago, and I was like, I'll take it, please. So I was delighted to get my hands on a copy because I hadn't read it. So this was my first time reading it.
Yeah, so I had read it before as we were working on the book, just sort of sifting through and looking at what was there. I'm curious, what were your thoughts as you read these first chapters of this book?
Yeah, well, so as I started reading it, at first I thought, I'm kind of curious that Kelsey wants to talk about this one because there's not much to talk about in the sense of like not much that was jumping out at me as like, these are flags or something like that. And it was a refreshing read. And I had relatively positive response to it for, I'd say, the first 30%. And on the whole, I think it's still, disclaimer, like I think it's a book with merit. But it was about midway through, I began to see a lot of the same ideas that are in Shepherding a Child's Heart, just with different verbiage. And I probably wouldn't have noticed that if I hadn't done such a deep dive on Shepherding a Child's Heart. I don't know when that would have exactly jumped out at me, and we'll talk about some of those things. But yeah, I was pleasantly surprised to find his tenor. It leans very heavily into mercy and grace, reminders to parents that they are more like their children than not. Like some of these needed qualifiers and correctives that often we talk about, like the anthropology of Christian parenting books where parents are on this godlike level and children are below, so he offers some correctives for that and invitations. I think if I had to sum it up, I would say this book, it's titled Parenting, but it felt like it was maybe a spiritual formation book for parents, maybe more than parenting. He does give principles, but even at the outset, he says he's not there to kind of give formulas or a roadmap. He really multiple times is kind of speaking to parents, inviting them to reorient their framework to be a posture where they see themselves as receiving mercy and grace and trusting God and extending that to children. So it's a different paradigm, I think, than a lot of the more formulaic books we've read or the books that are saying like, here's the way to do it. But some of that does show up. So yeah, it was interesting. I found it a curious one. I can see why it comes recommended, and I can see why a number of people have indicated that it was helpful to them. And I don't know, like we are always picking every resource apart, and I try and offer this disclaimer as much as possible. Any resources we look at, with a few exceptions, it's not to say there's nothing of merit in them or they didn't help families in any way. But often because of the authoritative posturing of the authors, it's problematic that there are any problems because those have far-reaching implications. So resources like this, where the author is just beginning with a posture of humility, that goes a long way, I think, toward equipping parents to have more freedom as they read, or to feel more seen, or to feel like there might be unique dynamics in their family. And he does touch on that throughout. So that those were all positives as I was reading. How did it land with you because you read it a while back and then refreshed?
Yeah, I had a similar reaction. I think I appreciated that it was a lot less formulaic, a lot less script driven. It has a lot of the tropes that I need to like. I feel like I could write a good parody of this kind of book at this point. Like,
yeah,
like he does this thing, and James Dobson does this all the time, where he's like talking about a thing, and then he's like this time with Sally and her young daughter.
Yes, yes,
and like it's like he sort of like breaks into these like aside anecdotes that like we're sort of supposed to trust are based in reality, probably of a family whose names he has changed, which that happens all the time. You know, obviously with like sharing, I don't want to like say that's necessarily a bad thing, but it's sort of, I always sort of like in the middle of one of those paragraphs, I am kind of like, this is a very convenient story for the point you're making, you know?
Right.
Anyway, I'm sure.
After you've read enough of the books, you're kind of like, how many of these are kind of like sermon illustrations, right? Like we all kind of know these are rhetorical devices to connect or give examples, but yeah, you read enough of them in sequence and you're like, huh.
Yes. And I don't want to suggest that he's making things up. I have no reason to think that, but it is a funny, like when you've read enough of these, you can like recognize exactly the structure of this section of the book. Like, yes, you could like predict when it's coming, and then there's sort of a certain way of talking through the example. Anyway, it's
so what I thought was interesting about his examples, and I don't know if this is true throughout, but there are a couple times in the book I thought what was a little bit different is often those examples in a lot of the books we've read are very much spotlighting behavior of children or what parents are getting wrong. But I did think a lot of his examples seemed like they were bids for connection with his readers, of kind of like articulating maybe exasperation or frustration parents feel or overwhelm they feel. So kind of describing everyday scenarios that parents might relate to in this sense of like, I don't know what to do, or I am trying this and isn't working, or I don't know. So I thought that was a slightly different usage of those. There were some new news stories that I hadn't heard before. You know what I mean? New tropes.
Yeah.
In that sense.
Yeah. And I also appreciated that I think it seems like in places he is trying to push back on the ultimacy of parenthood and family structure as a source of Christian identity. I think in the more like dominionist and fundamentalist resources we've looked at, parenthood, family structure, parental authority are so like fundamental to Christian identity, or they're like the ideal version of what it is to be a Christian. You know, the ideal version of a Christian adult woman is as a mother and wife. The ideal version of a Christian adult male is a father and a husband. And he talks at length in one of the chapters about not finding your identity in children and those kinds of things. And
Yes.
I appreciated that. I think
Mhm.
that is a good, I think that was probably, I'm thinking he's writing this in 2016. We're well into the age of social media then.
Mhm.
You've got momfluencers, you've got mom
Yep.
vlogs, you've got all this. And I think I did appreciate that kind of tempering language
Mhm.
toward what family does and does not offer you
Yep.
as a Christian person. I did appreciate that.
Yeah, and kind of a counterbalance to some of that. Children are your arrows, children are your testimony, children are. And he didn't necessarily address the religious version of that as much as he kind of talked about overscheduling or wanting your children to succeed in various ways, kind of more American culture things, I would say. But yeah, it was a point well taken. It made me think of like the arrows and the children are the like arrows in a man's quiver, or testimonies, Christian testimony, evidence of Christian transformation in people's family life. And he doesn't really speak to those things, but he does talk about like kind of the American cultural overscheduling or wanting your children to be successful in certain ways, and kind of pushes back against that. So I thought that was helpful, because we talk about how many of these resources cause problems for families down the road because they present children as extensions of parents and raise parental expectations to say, start your children off right and they'll walk in that way. And so he offers some really helpful I think invitation is the word I kept coming back to, because he does it in a pretty measured and kind of companion on the journey way, as he's writing and explaining all these things, and really invites parents to consider that parenting is a long game. There's a number of places where he says, you can't control your child no matter what you do. And so some of those things they're glaringly absent in so many other resources, that it was quite nice to read a resource, a very clearly evangelical Christian parenting resource that had a number of those things clearly articulated.
Yeah. Yeah. I appreciated that too. I think, one thing that I appreciate about this is that I think if you were to ask like Ted Tripp or I don't know, the Pearls or the Ezzos,
Yeah,
are you the owners of your children? They would probably push back on that language. Like,
right.
I wouldn't say this is like a owner, but so much of the language in those resources gives the impression that parents are really supposed to treat their children that
Mhm,
way, right? Like
mhm.
the absolute primacy of
Yep,
parental authority
yep,
as being the first principle. The if not in ownership, in control.
yes.
And I think he does write about, I think he talks about it as ambassador
Mhm,
parenting as
mhm.
opposed to, and he sort of names that
Yeah,
parenting is a bad approach. And
yeah,
like I said, I think that most writers would not say own, but I think he probably, like us, sees that as like
yes.
some implication of some of what's come
Mhm.
before and is trying to push back against that
Yeah,
by talking about being ambassadors as opposed to like God's representatives,
yes.
or like a stand-in of some kind.
Yeah,
Um, and I appreciate that. I do think there's still some, potential, I don't know. I would quibble sometimes with his language, and we'll get
right.
to that. But I would say, on the whole, I appreciated that attempt to differentiate between this really authoritarian
Yeah,
posture towards children and like a fellow traveler guide.
yes.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah, it was nice. And similarly, there are a number of places where he does bring more theological biblical depth than I've seen in maybe any other resource. I mean, there are a few, like for instance, Growing Kids God's Way, since we just read that recently, that have like pages after pages, like almost exhaustive um, explanation of ideas. So, but almost in a so it's such a like fire hose that I think it washes away ability for parents to really critically engage that, because it's like Gothard's, number of steps. It's just so laid out and so formulaic. And who are you to question this clearly detailed and thorough, and someone's clearly studied more than you have and just really kind of comes across that way. And so he doesn't, it's not that there aren't any resources that don't attempt to offer depth, but often it's like that or nothing. It's either that kind of almost indoctrinational level depth or, oh, here's a verse in a parentheses that maybe somebody's going to look up or maybe not. And so he does offer, like, for instance, when he's talking about sin later on, he says he makes this distinction between sin and iniquity and transgression. And it's not like it's a theological treatise or anything. You might hear it in a sermon on sin, maybe would make those same distinctions. But I pointed out here just because that sort of thing is so missing from many Christian parenting resources. It's just from the beginning assumed everyone knows what sin is and that children are sinners. And so we're going to start talking from that perspective rather than even trying to make some kind of distinctions. Now, I didn't agree necessarily with all the distinctions he made, and I had some problems with some of his theological framing, but that is, again, so much easier to engage, or not even easier, feels like so much more of a healthy starting point than when there's nothing to engage there or it's so heavy-handed. At least somebody's showing you their cards and they're like, this is my theological perspective, and they're articulating it somehow so you can then understand what kind of advice is flowing out of that.
Yeah. Yeah, that is helpful. I think so many of the resources that we've read have really just kind of like put child sin nature and disobedience just in this one kind of like very broad definition of sin, right. Just kind of almost as a tool to just give parents a label to put on certain behavior so that they can come down on it a certain way.
Yeah.
So there's still a little bit of this here, but I think you're right. He does at least attempt to like offer something that is more nuanced and gives space for some discussion about, what we make of child behavior and how we might kind of think and talk about sin a bit differently, which I do appreciate.
Yeah. Well, and we've talked on other episodes before how a lot of times when you read this, it's almost like the reader is being parented by the author, right? In the way that they're framing their arguments and everything. So, L.R. Nost, it's almost like you're being attachment parented as you read her book. Jim and Lynn Jackson talk about, the way they're trying to connect with their readers and empower them and coach them, which fits with their framework. Ted Tripp, there's so much scrupulous devotion. It's almost like you're being, I don't know, invited to like a 24-hour prayer meeting when you're reading his. And so it was interesting to read this one and see this kind of, I think what would be really accessible for a lot of people, kind of like a warm pastoral voice that still has confident authority. I mean, it felt like it really typified the kind of middle of the road, trusted male evangelical voice. Right? Like the way he's talking, it's humble, where he's sharing some of his own mistakes and observations, but it's also authoritative. I don't know. It was interesting to try and be like, what's this voice? But about 30% of the way through, I started seeing the Ted Tripp stuff showing up. And I mean, who knows? I don't know if they just have the same shared framework, if that's the result of Westminster and nouthetic thought, if that's their own background. I don't know. But it mapped pretty closely once we got into the center of it.
Yeah. 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 No, I think that's right. I think I wouldn't say there's like a tone shift. It's just all of a sudden the ideas pop up and you're kind of like, oh, right.
Right.
There are still a lot of the same beliefs about children, and you start seeing these same ideas about sin nature, lostness, authority, that he had kind of, I felt like was trying to nuance and maybe offer something different.
Yeah, then it was, nope.
And what's there is just kind of is quite familiar in a lot of ways.
Right. Well, right. And the tone doesn't shift. The writing is still filled in on grace and mercy for parents and children. Like that's kind of a running theme. But he does pivot to this space of kind of like deconstructing parenting is about control or about owning your children, to it's all about your child's heart and your child's worship and your child's orientation to God. So he uses different language, but this is the heartbeat of shepherding a child's heart, right?
Absolutely. Yes, your child's worship. Your child is always worshiping something.
It's always worshiping something. And he talks about this, and all I could think of was Ted Tripp's little hand pencil line drawing of like a child bowing down to an idol and the picture of the heart, because shepherding a child's heart, the early editions has these little line drawings. But yeah, this idea that what is your child worshiping in any given moment? It's either going to be God or something idolatrous. And Paul David uses the term, I don't know if he uses the term of idolatry. I didn't write it in my notes if he does, but he does have a whole chapter on children as worshipers of something, and parents can help them worship God. But again, this primarily involves sussing out a child's sin and helping them understand where they've gone astray from worshiping God. And I thought that was interesting to me because it made me think of actually some of the reading I've done in Sally Clarkson's books, who doesn't take this, to my memory, I haven't read her books in a number of years, doesn't talk about idolatry of the heart, but is pretty focused on inviting children to kind of this sense of wonder and beauty that would cultivate their appetites to draw close to God and worship God. And that jumped to my mind of how interesting you kind of can, if this is your framework that you really believe it's a parent's job to cultivate them as worshipers of God, there are a couple ways to do it. And one is to point out where they are idolatrous and getting it wrong. And another is to really whet their appetites for what you perceive is going to attach them to God. So I thought that note still was there. And it still was parents assigning adult motivations to children, even very young children, because he talks about 3-year-olds and young children being rebellious. And it is that either or framework that Ted Tripp has as well. Like you're either in submission to God. I think he uses God consciousness and God submission are kind of key elements, or you're in rebellion. And that is a marker of, I don't know if he would say total depravity, but certainly of original sin. That's your like status from day one. And so everything the parent's doing is trying to kind of cultivate in an environment that will help a child out of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think the assumption, and this is not unique to Paul David Tripp or to Ted Tripp, but the assumption is sort of that like your child is going to be irresistibly drawn toward idolatry all the time.
Right.
And a really important part of your job is like spotting it and correcting it and spotting it and correcting it. And we've seen that elsewhere before. It comes with different language, but this idea that like your job is to kind of be the constant overseer of your child's worship, because everything they do is worship. I think, there are probably plenty of people who read this and just kind of washed over them like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But I think there are people for who, especially newer believers or people who are really, really trying to do this right. You can easily see how that becomes this, we talk about heavy yokes, this heavy burden of like, I'm watching my child's soccer game and they're having a hard time with something, or they're, angry at a teammate. What are they, where is this worship gone wrong? Like it just opens up the possibility of like every hard moment to be viewed through the lens of idol worship or worship of God. And I'm not saying that like these moments are not spiritual in some way. It just kind of forces a parent's hand to put everything into a sin or God-honoring worship bucket. Like all of these moments, it kind of offers that as a framework, and very little gray area. We talk a lot about how little like neutral ground there is for children to be behaving. And if it's not entirely spiritual neutral, even the idea that like we should maybe treat it as neutral because we don't have access to our child's inner lives, So that always sticks out to me.
Yeah, for sure. And this too does not have a discussion of child development, similar to shepherding a child's heart. So as a result, everything, we've talked about this in a lot of these resources, everything is flattened. So the expectations for adult believers and 3-year-old children are the same. Like there's not a set, and then there's no even space for parents to be able to be like, yes, my child may not be able to process this sequence of instructions yet, or my child may be developmentally at an age where they're saying no or where they don't want to share. And I think because in Christian parenting resources, it feels like we're giving sin a pass or something to acknowledge those things, it can be uncomfortable for parents when they have this kind of framework. And then every moment, not just as like a sermon opportunity, but kind of like, am I missing the moment to really help my child understand the law? I think he has a chapter called The Law, so that they can understand their need for grace. And we have a chapter in our book that talks about sin in Christian parenting. And one of the things when I was researching for it, I just kept being struck by was how for the vast majority of church history, this was not a conversation that was happening. Like people were not parsing the motivations of their very young children's hearts according to sin categories. There was this idea of like, baptize your babies quickly before they might die from disease or poor health or malnutrition. And then as they're older, the question of catechesis crops up. And it's not to say it wasn't important or that parents weren't teaching their children in those early years or something, but our evangelical obsession with like from the very earliest days, children need to hear about the law and their need for grace and their need for salvation and their sinfulness. It doesn't matter how much you couch that with language, I think, about grace and mercy, because the very real practical application is parents who are like trained to look for failure and call it sin and remind their children of it, even if it's in a gracious way. Mm-hmm. They're still saying, look, because you were, wanted your way in this. I think at one point he just talks about that. His chapter on foolishness was the only part in this book I got actually quite angry. This one felt like it has a lot to offer parents, to then see that slipped in there where it was going to be a dehumanizing view of children, like anything in their childlike development is foolishness, and quoting all these proverbs that are about fools, yes, but they're about adult fools. So this idea, and yes, there's one or two proverbs that talk about folly being bound up in the heart of a child, but to then do a little equal sign and be like, therefore, every verse in the Proverbs that talks about fools applies to children is a motivated reading that I don't think we have license to do. So then this idea that when a child is like wanting their own preference for food, they are being like sinful. That's a big leap that has, I think, profound implications for the way parents view their children and engage their children, and ultimately the way children's self-awareness develops, where they perceive themselves in that sort of way. For instance, there's this whole passage where this is on page 130 and 131, where he says, you may be asking yourself right now, what is foolishness? And then he lists off these things. The fool has the world inside out and upside down, looks at what is foolish and sees it as wise, looks at what is good, sees it as bad, looks at what is false and sees it as true, hates to be ruled by another, hates to have to stay inside of boundaries, wants his own way, looks at others as being in the way, on and on. That's only about half of it. And then it's just immediately translated onto children of all ages. And in the very next section, then he quotes Psalm 53 at length, where the fool says in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt, doing abominable. He quotes that passage. And then says the epicenter of the foolishness that is in the heart of every child is deeply theological. Most Christian parents fail to understand this. The struggles over food, sleep, homework, sibling conflict, possessions, wardrobe, and dating are theological struggles. You see, at the center of the foolishness of the children you are called to parent is a denial of God. This, and a few sentences later, this denial of God is living without a sense of need for his authority, wisdom, power, and grace. And as I read that, it upset me because I was thinking of tender little children when you first tell them a story about Jesus. Or if you've ever taught in like a very young child's Sunday school class, like many of them love Jesus. Jesus is the hero of the Sunday school stories. And to take this like theological presuppositional starting place and in this heavy-handed a way, apply it across the board to the motivations of children is really destructive. Like, on what basis are children rebelling against God in that sense when he's saying all the struggles a parent has, food, sleep, homework, that are part of growing into maturity? Part of how we learn is through mistakes, is through rubbing up against conflict and a number of other things. And just thinking it's assigning a heart attitude of rebellion that I think is incompatible. I'm not saying every young child is like, I love God and want to follow God, but just in general, many children are. They're very curious and open to that. So this idea that no, don't listen to what the child is saying or observe what they're doing, their heart, but based on their inability to meet parental expectations for behavior, is this level of foolishness, that they're saying there is no God, that they're in rebellion, in like outright rejection. It just felt like such a big leap to be making this foundational. And at different points in the book, I got the sense that he was writing to maybe parents of older children. And maybe from a nouthetic framework, I could see a chapter like this in a book, maybe talking about teenagers, to say, maybe teenagers who have articulated, I'm not interested in the faith or in God, or have rejected it. Maybe, I don't know. It just struck such a discordant note for me, because this is the exact same thing Ted Tripp talks about, right? Like, just with nicer language.
Yeah. Yeah. There's that foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child, right? Like that particular verse seems to give a lot of permission to then like take that word fool, foolish. And the Proverbs are full of that word, right? And so like, there's this just like, oh, this is all interchangeable. These are all qualities. Right. These are all kinds of foolishness. These are all qualities of a fool. And we know that foolishness is bound up. So all of these things, of these things are in the heart of every child. And it's such a blunt way of reading this, right. Because I don't think we're supposed to take away from that. Everyone is foolish in all the same ways. Everyone is prone to the same kinds of foolishness. Right. All kinds of foolishness are equally present in everyone. Like, I think it's just it's just treating this as such a blunt object in terms of looking at a human being, because there are some things that children are more likely to do. And that when they do them, I don't look and call that child a foolish child. If they were 35 and doing it, I would call them a foolish 35-year-old. Yeah. So there are some things like that, right? That there are some things that children do because they don't know, they don't know yet. They don't know better yet. And I think it's a choice to call that foolishness. Yeah. Versus naivete versus
immaturity. Yeah, there's a number of words. Yeah.
Or just childlikeness, right? Like being childish and being a child, and having just assigning kind of sinful foolishness to things that really we maybe should just be calling childlike, because we also know that there are some things that are particularly childish that we are supposed to aspire to as well. Right. And it's just using this as such a blunt object. I think.
Yeah. And again, it requires the sort of assuming you are privy to somebody else's motivations that is at odds with his opening, where he does call parents out for that. So then to find that here, I think, was really frustrating, because it's not to say that children are never rebellious or something, or there may not be times when they are foolish. But I think the consistent application of this, Gary Ezzo uses it too. He has whole chapters on foolishness. And I'm pretty sure he carries that over into his secular resources on becoming as an example, because he can't call it disobedience there or rebellion. I think he calls it in rebellion in one and foolishness in the other or something. But it requires you to identify their motives, which again makes children into like adults in little bodies, because even in a moment of quote unquote rebellion, like say a child doesn't want to leave when the parent says it's time to go, and the child throws a tantrum or something, where maybe everyone could be like, oh yeah, they really are just not listening to the parent's authority or something. To then go inside and be like, that's because they are willfully rejecting authority, or they are determined to have their own way, it is really assigning an adult's perspective. Because I think for very young children, often so much of that is just very quick. Like there's not these thought processes. There is very much this, everyone's always telling me what to do. And sometimes I'm prepared to even process that, and sometimes I'm not. And so it's again this requiring children to have the same kind of processes adults do. Therefore, if an adult were acting that way, the motivation would be this sort of like willful battle of the wills. I'm going to show you, mom, and often we're reading that back into it. And so again, with Paul David, Romans 1 shows up, as it did with Ted Tripp. And it kind of drove me bananas when it showed up with Ted Tripp as well, because it's a long, if you remember in the opening of Romans 1, and it's this, I may pull, I've got a Bible right here. I may pull a little bit. It's unclear whether Paul is quoting someone else or not. Scholars disagree over that. But in any case, it's this whole segment about God's wrath being revealed against the godlessness and unrighteousness of people, and who suppress their truth because what can be known about God is evident to them. They knew God, they did not glorify him. They claiming to be wise, they became fools, worshiped animals. God delivered them over to sexual impurity and disgraceful passions. And they go on. They were filled with evil, greed, and wickedness, blah, blah, blah. And it's like half a chapter. And when it's referenced in parenting books, I'm like, are we really thinking that this is Paul's anthropology of children he's laying out here? I think we could have a conversation about systematic theology and total depravity based on this passages, but is Paul really writing this to describe the heart motivations of little children? Because why do we go there with that? Like, why does this show up? And are we really saying that children are resisting exchanging the glory of a more, like the level of kind of ham-fisted, like equating this is just bad hermeneutics to begin with. Like, Paul's talking about Gentiles here. He's talking about specific things if he's not quoting someone. So first, to be like, is this for everyone across the board? Secondly, why are we assigning these motivations to a child who doesn't want to take their nap? Is it because at one point in verse 30, Paul says they're God-haters, arrogant, proud, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents? Is it because we see parents show up here? Is this like what we do with Hebrews 12, where we're like, it mentions parents, so it's a parenting passage, Because I would contend that, no, this is talking about a certain dynamic in adult society where the family has broken down in significant ways as far as honoring parents. Maybe he had in mind very young children in this long list of evildoers, but it drives me bananas when it shows up in Christian parenting resources, because most people are not going to look up the passage. If they do, they're not going to read it in the whole context of the book. And as a result, they're going to come away being like, total depravity mindset applies to my child and it's Bible backed, even though there are a lot of layers of interpretive reading to get to that point. And maybe that is Paul David's point. I mean, it does, maybe he is a total depravity guy. I thought at different times as I was reading where I was like, oh, maybe that really is his belief. But he's not using that term when he's talking about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I actually don't know the answer to that. I didn't do like a deep
Yeah.
dive on other teaching and preaching. I'm sure that
Yeah.
that information is out there. So listeners, if you have that information, feel free to share it in a comment or something on social media. But it does, I am guessing he's a total depravity guy.
Yeah. Well, and I'm guessing if he did his demon at Westminster and just seeing these same thoughts, it really pinged the Nouthetic biblical counseling model for me. And even if he's still, I don't know if he's still in that camp, maybe if that was his training, he's still pulling on some of those ideas. And that feels like a hallmark to me of the Nouthetic when there are these big categorical claims that are kind of applied across the board to everyone. And it becomes about, everything becomes this teaching moment, this moment of eternal stakes, not in like lose your salvation, but in like, are you worshiping God or are you not? That kind of thing. Do you need to put off sin or put on righteousness in this moment? There's kind of a lot of these, it's an either or moment, which is challenging because that's just a heavy burden for everyone, parents included. Like nobody can just be tired or grumpy or have, sure, maybe spoken unkindly to someone, but to just have it be a human error. Everything is incredibly elevated to this. Oh, it's exhausting sometimes to think about when people do try to live under that. But anyway, what other things pinged you as related to shepherding a child's heart?
Yeah, well, and this isn't necessarily even directly related to shepherding a child's heart, but it did strike me, of course, that we have, disobedience that isn't right away with a smile and a happy heart is not real obedience. That's
it doesn't count.
It's like playing the hits, you've got the obey. And I would laugh to myself because I just recently saw like an Instagram reel of a mom in the car, like making her kids like repeat to her, like, I will obey right away, all the way with a happy heart, just like, wow, that's a real thing. And when I see that, I'm like, I get it. Life would be so much easier.
For sure.
Of course, that's like everyone's choice. But
well, especially with parents of little kids, like logistically, that'd be great if everyone did it right away, cheerfully, instantly. Sure, that would be really smooth operations, in that sense, in the same way that, if you're an employee, if everyone at your workplace just did what the supervisor said instantly without question and cheerfully, like you'd probably be really efficient. And the supervisor would be pleased because their agenda was being accomplished. Whether that's a great workplace, I don't know. Whether that's a great family dynamic, I don't know. But
right, yeah, this claim, obedience with whining or something is not real obedience.
Yeah, and he gives some anecdotes to that. I think of like you need to kind of teach your children that if they're stomping while they're obeying, it's not really obeying. And so it is talking about the heart. Like he says at one point, children are controlled by their heart. So he never pulls out shepherding a child's heart language, but it's there.
No. And yeah, I think like that kind of rhetoric, I mean, for me is very familiar. I see it all the time. I hear it all the time. And I just feel for children who are like, following an instruction, but upset about it.
Yeah.
How many times as an adult do I do something I don't want to do? I do it, but I'm upset that I have to do it,
Yeah.
And I think this again kind of pinged the Nouthetic Biblical Counseling thing for me. Just this idea of being able to take every thought captive and change it, right?
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't matter
Just
if you
choose
don't like
joy.
it.
You can
You
do
need to
it.
learn to change how you feel, or at least how you're acting you feel about this, which I think is, I think there's well, we've talked about this before. There seems to be this belief that if you force children to fake it, that will eventually become real. If you force children to pretend to be happy about doing something they don't want to do, you force children to recognize when they're angry and then smile at you and pretend they're not upset about doing something, that eventually that will become their automatic response to having to do something. And I'm not convinced that that's teaching children what we think it's teaching them, you know?
Yeah. Or
And
it's another one of those things that I think feels short-sighted, where it's like, it may work out for a while, but I think there's a number of adults who can attest to it. At a certain point, it just doesn't hold anymore. Like, you can repress or suppress your emotions in a number of different ways, but then they come out in other ways. It goes sideways because we are emotional people. Like, that's part of our being created in the image of God. That's part of our humanity. So this idea that we can be robotic with our emotions or simply choose them to be a certain way, it doesn't erase them. I think it doesn't. And unfortunately, it doesn't teach children how to navigate their emotions. It just teaches that there are only a few permissible ones you can have. And so then I think when children reach young adulthood or adulthood and they discover these other emotions, they're very ill-equipped to know how to navigate that. Or they'll feel guilty for feeling something, or they'll come out in different ways, in manipulative ways, because that's the only way you can express sadness is in this certain way or something. And I think it has all these sort of weird, unintended side effects. And it's unfortunate, because I think most parents would not want that, right? For the short-term payoff of nobody grumped in the grocery store, or something like that. Feels like you're doing it all right, and that's going to really help in the young years. But I think then when you see a teen trying to navigate their emotions, or adults facing something very difficult, or a long season of difficulty, or even some of the things we talked about with Catherine and Jason a couple weeks ago, just difficulties in faith and disillusionment, doubt, despair. And when remind yourself of a Bible verse and try harder stops working, then a lot of people are willing to walk away from it all, So
yeah,
I don't know. Yeah.
and I think too, there's like a real downstream potential for children to just sort of believe that in relationships with their parents, certain emotions are not safe.
Yeah.
And that their parents will come down really hard on any kind of confrontation. Confrontation isn't okay. And what happens in future relationships when there is confrontation,
Yeah.
and I think it gives a really, how do I say this? Gives a really like thin view of what human relationships can withstand.
Yeah.
I think when you grow up in a household where your parents are so fragile that they cannot withstand your whining or your upset without losing it or hurting you, you view human relationships as really fragile.
Yeah.
And I mean, relationships can be fragile, but also there is a way to deal with conflict in a healthy way. There's a way to say, I don't want to do this.
Right. Or to feel anger and know what to do with that, like know how to respond to that in a healthy way. And similarly, I think it leaves parents in their own immaturity and fragility, because if your parental response is always, I need to have instant obedience, I can't tolerate any complaining or any pushback or any divergent thought, not only is that going to impair connection later on, but it becomes really threatening then when an adult child or someone else does something different. And it makes me think of, there was like a tweet recently I saw pop up, which was, oh, I don't know, it was some big pastor name on Twitter who was talking about church hurt. And he was like, yeah, I've been hurt by the church too. And I got over it. Like, get over it and move on, kind of he said it in like some quippy way. But I thought, yeah, that is going to be the response of leaders or parents who are threatened by anybody articulating anything but cheerful, right away, all the way obedience, is to shut it down, is to be like, get over it, or stop with your victimhood, or stop with your whatever. Like, it's like, I'll give you something real to cry about. It's coming with that energy, you know? And it's unfortunate because that is not going to help relationships down the road, and leaves parents in a really emotionally immature state as well, when there could be a lot of opportunities for their own growth, which again is why it was kind of a surprise, because the opening of this book seems to see that and want to tend to that, want to invite parents to see parenthood as something that could be formative for them, that could be something where they could receive grace and mercy and then extend it to others. So it was, I don't know. Yeah, I wish he had gone back to the drawing board for it all. Rather, my impression was like he had done a lot of, and he talks about how he had a moment somewhere along in his parenting journey where he kind of had a failure moment where he responded with a lot of harshness. And it was like I want to stop doing things in that way. And so it felt like there was a lot of that in the early parts of the book, but this, probably because it felt so similar to what Ted had said, felt like these are the old presuppositional principles that everyone was given in seminary, or all the ACBC manuals are handing out, that everyone keeps adapting and circulating in these resources. And he couldn't let go of them.
Yeah. That story, like the kind of like, I need to do things differently story stuck out to me in the context of this, because I think that's why so many parents go to a parenting book like this.
Yeah.
They have some kind of experience where they're like, I don't know what to do with this situation. There's something in me that is not equipped to deal with this. I don't have the emotional tools. I don't have the language. I don't have the point of view. And I think one thing that has stood out to me from the very beginning of when we started working on this book was that a lot of mainstream parenting resources right now really bend over backward to tell parents to assume the best of their kids and treat emotions as neutral and try to sort of be above their children's tantrums and sort of, take this really I don't even sort of above the fray approach to children. And one of the suggestions there is that the way you perceive your children will absolutely impact the way you treat them and the way you respond to them. So if you perceive what they're doing as terrible, or like, my child is going to be a delinquent, you're going to be terribly fearful, right? Like, so there are a lot of, voices out there trying to discourage parents from thinking that way, because there's this belief that if you cannot perceive it that way, you will actually experience it differently and respond to it differently. But a lot of these Christian resources don't let you go there, because that would be giving sin a pass. So like, they're not willing to extend this believe the best kind of language, or even like kind of transcend whatever's happening, or treat it as neutral. It can't do that, because these writers are so concerned about parents not adequately dealing with sin. And it makes me sad when I read them, because I just think for parents who are looking for relief or a different framework that will help them see their children differently and respond to them differently, doubling down on sin and requiring obedience and seeing whining as like, oh, they're not really obeying. Those kinds of things do not help toward that
Yeah.
end. They double down on perceiving what your children are, perceiving behavior as sinful and
Mhm.
bad, in need of correction, and correction in a way that has like potential cosmic
Yeah.
consequences. And so that
Yeah.
just, it strikes me as a missed opportunity
Mhm.
that I think the framework that a lot of these writers have for sin and sin nature just kind of like just prevents them from getting there. They can't help themselves.
Yeah, I think so. And it's unfortunate as far as theological consistency as well, because it really leaves, you can only take this kind of refreshing, like, don't worry, you are held by God, it's out of your control. That's kind of incompatible with this other framework that is saying you need to make your child aware of the law and how they fall short so they can accept the gospel, so they can come to saving faith in Christ, which is woven throughout the second part of this book. And those are kind of at odds with each other, because if if it really if it really is super important, if the work of parenting really is to help your child understand that they're a worshiper, to help introduce them to the glory of God, whatever that means. He has a chapter, he kind of talks about that. Like, this is, which always feels very, probably too many years hearing from John Piper, but to be like, what does that mean? What are we talking about when we say children need to understand the glory of God? Those kind of Christianese gets at, like, sort of like, let's breeze on by that, gets at me like, yes, it's in the catechism. That makes sense. Glory of God, chief end of man. What do you mean by that for children? But anyway, to sort of then say, oh, that's on the parent. Yes, they're helped by God. I mean, I think he had a lot more of that tones there. Like, you can rely on God to help you and give you the wisdom to do this and give you the insight. But still, it's on a parent to, in these day-to-day interactions, understand what's going on in their child's heart, help teach them what's going on, help them see how that falls short, so that they know their need for a savior, so they can be drawn to him. And I'm not exactly sure with this book and with Shepherding a Child's Heart what's supposed to happen then, right? Like, these all fit a very specific theological framework of how you become a Christian, right? Like, you understand your need for Christ, and then you accept, and then you walk. But in the day in, day out, what does that look like to a child? So maybe they accepted Jesus at age 5. I was 4 when I said the sinner's prayer, right? So no shade on that. Like, that's how I came to know the Lord. But maybe they said the sinner's prayer. So now when they make a mistake, or when they do something that their parent perceives as sinful, they're going to be given a little sermonette about how it falls short, how they're not worshiping God. But if they are a believer, what are they supposed to do with that? It's just a reminder of, like, you've failed to be perfect, essentially. Like, you've failed to be perfect. And again, it's this weird, vague, like, isn't it good news? Jesus is there for you in your imperfection. But it's not really good news, because it's just a parent continually pointing out imperfections in this spiritualized framework. And if the child's not a believer, whatever we say we mean by that, because there's a number of people who said the sinner's prayer at age 5 or 6, and then, oh, what do you know? Like, yes, you're very vulnerable to those sort of claims and invitations at age 5 in your concrete thinking stage. Maybe they weren't equipped to be that. They don't identify as a believer, or in teenage years or further on. What are they to make of this? Or if they've never said the sinner's prayer and the parents just finally eagerly waiting to see that, are they constantly hearing, like, you need Jesus or else? Like, is this, kids have a lot of questions. Is this raising questions of, like, is God going to punish them? Is this coming with a parsing out of what does being separate from God mean? Or are they being quoted, these verses from Proverbs? And is their self-identity being formed as a fool who says there's no God in their heart, et cetera, et cetera? I mean, I'm always very curious to be like, okay, we can read by some of this in the page, but how does this play out day in and day out for parents? Many of them are trying to hit a moving target. They may not be equipped to even answer these questions. So they're going to be quoting what's in the books, or, trying to rehearse the scripts, the anecdotes they've read, and come up with something that feels close to this range, because of course they really want their child to know Jesus. And they've been told this is the really important work of parenting, which Paul David Tripp, when he's asked of his like top verse on parenting, he quotes the Great Commission. So he obviously believes like discipleship is number one. And this is what discipleship looks like, is this presentation of the gospel in this very specific way. And I think it's really important that we question these things, not because there's nothing in here I'm not saying like this is unorthodox. There's a number of, I'm sure, children's ministries and churches who would sign on board to a lot of elements of that and say that those are important ingredients of faith formation in families. But I do think it's important that we all take a beat and think about that and think, what is the actual like long-term fruit of this? What are we hoping to do here? And what does that say about our ability for the Holy Spirit to convict people's hearts, draw people to himself? If we truly believe as Christians regeneration is a miraculous work of God, if we believe that, whatever corner of the church we find ourselves of how that exactly translates in daily activity, then this sort of prescription that parents really need to constantly be holding sin up for their children and recounting the gospel in this sin come to the cross. I still have a question mark about what's supposed to happen after that, because children are going to continue to mess up. Like they're designed to grow that way. They're going to continue to fall short of perfection and miss the mark of expected righteousness, whether you think it's Romans 1 or not. So what then for Christian children is this? Do they think that they'll achieve it at some point? Families operating by this? Will there be less need for this kind of catechesis as their children perform better? I don't know. I don't know what's supposed to happen. What do you think's supposed to be that question mark? What's the good news there for kids, do you think?
Oh, I don't know. I don't think this book is so concerned about good news for kids as it is good news for parents. Like I think that's sort of like my takeaway here, if we're kind of going to wrap up our conversation, is just, I think this book is trying to offer good news to parents.
Yeah.
And I think it offers some, but I think in service of offering some good news to parents, like your children really should obey you, it does some other things, right? Like I think sometimes when parenthood is hard, what feels like good news to a parent, like, yeah, you should be mad about that, is actually permission to perceive your children a way that you don't actually want to perceive your children. But in the moment, that's kind of what you want. I think, again, we've said it multiple times, but I do want to say it again. I don't think this is a terrible book. I mean, in terms of the ones that we've read, I understand. I see why this one is a popular one. But I also think that for most readers, there's a lot of discernment required here to kind of poke at some of these ideas and just say, I don't know, I feel like taken to their actual ends, this isn't actually good news for my family. But that's my takeaway. What's your takeaway?
Yeah, I think similarly. I think it's a mixed bag. Some of it is, like I said, I think the opening chapters, I was nodding along and was glad to see a lot of the qualifications he makes. They're absent in a number of resources. I think the mixing of the day in, day out of just a lot of ordinary kind of thankless parenting with these sort of spiritual, like heavy spiritual goals, I think is always kind of a bad combination. I think there's just a lot of ordinariness to taking care of another human being who it can be difficult at times. And when you're in the role of the caregiver and the more mature person in that sense, to borrow from the language of maturity, like it can be triggering. It can be frustrating maybe to see immaturity or to constantly be doing that. Like a lot of parenting resources talk about, like, yeah, you'll need to say it 200 times. That's just the reality. And I think if as Christians we could pause and think about what we envision as God's creative design and maybe understand that there's a purpose in that, maybe we could do away with the sum of this obey right away without question, and delayed obedience is disobedience. These sort of things that really reveal our impatience with the process of lifelong, to borrow Paul David's conclusion, discipleship, which really involves a kind of consistent long-term presence and mentoring, not the sort of like get it all together and move on. And I don't think Paul David's saying that. Again, that's why this one kind of riled me up in the middle, because I'm like, so there's much to appreciate here, but then right in the middle, there's multiple chapters that have this heavy baggage, this really heavy, cloaked, spiritually heavy stuff that I think is incomplete, inaccurate in some ways. Maybe I just take issue with the theological implications, but it's almost more red flaggy to me because it comes with so many, it comes so nuanced, right? Like the way he talks about the terminology. So I don't know. I've got mixed feelings about this one. I'd be curious to hear from people who found this helpful, because obviously at this point, having written our book, having read so many resources, I wasn't necessarily trying to write this. Like when we were writing our book, I was trying to be very arm's length and objective, reading different resources. At this point, book is done. We're just here to talk about this book. So I've got my magnifying glass out and I'm like, oh, I see you, Ted Tripp, in there. So I'm very curious to hear from some people who found this to be helpful. Maybe they read right over that, or maybe that landed in a refreshing way for them. That for me at this point, I'm just like, can we stop calling children, Romans 1 and fools? Can we stop with that? Anyway, I do think, last thing I want to say, because there's not much about the Tripp's background. But I do want to know, I can't remember which one of it. There's an interview, it might be with Paul David. There's an interview with one of them. I think it's Paul David with Desiring God Ministries. They talk about their home being chaotic. And I don't think he uses the word abuse, but I remember when I was reading it, I got the strong impression that their childhood home was not a safe place, or a place where maybe they experienced some of the trustworthiness of parents. And I think a lot about that. We have some reels about Doug Wilson, because he talks about his father's violence when he was young. And so I wonder a lot of times how much of parenting experts' own formative experiences then shape some of their advice, but also move the window of what feels normal. Like in a sense of like, if you're in a very chaotic background, then maybe something where parents are at least thinking about children through an eternal framework, or I don't know. The Tripps didn't give specifics about their background, so I don't want to speak to that too much. But I wonder sometimes, none of this is about context, whether it's historical context or the personal context of the authors, how much that plays into it. And I thought that was interesting, given that both brothers ended up in ministry, drawn to the nouthetic framework to some degree, and kind of interested in offering that to people in some degree. So I don't know.
Yeah. I hadn't thought of that. That's a good thought, though. I don't really know much about their backgrounds at all.
Yeah, I don't
It's
think they've
really
talked much about it.
that they have had such similar trajectories, and that they wrote these two parenting books separated by 30 years.
Right. Well, I want to ask, like, did he read Ted's and
I'm sure he did.
Want to draw some of that, or was this their shared framework before? I don't know. We reached out to a bunch of people, and we got a really, did I ever share it with you? I don't know. A really lovely response from Paul David Tripp's ministry. Because blasted a bunch of people to see if anyone wanted to talk to us as we were writing the book. And it was a no, but it was kind of like he's humbled or something to be included as a puppy. You know, it was a gracious response. I would have loved to talk to him. I think we only had one taker for our parenting expert
Not interested
to interview with us. So
unsurprisingly, but not
surprisingly. Yeah. Anyway.
Well, thank you for joining us, listeners, in the church library this week. Like we said, we would love to hear from you if you found this book to be particularly useful or if you're part of a church that uses it regularly. I'm so curious to know what that looks like and what the response to it has been, actually. So you can find us on social media. You can send us a message on Buzzsprout. We'd love to hear from you. We have a couple of episodes left in this season of In the Church Library, a couple more interviews to come with authors and writers we admire with different perspectives. We have one coming up with Sunita Tees on neurodivergence and parenting, and the failure of Christian parenting books to really ever deal with neurodivergence. I think that is starting to change, but that has been something we have noticed. So we're super excited for those conversations coming up soon. So we hope you will join us next time around. Marissa, it was lovely to talk with you.
It was great to see you and chat with you as always. Thank you.
All right. Bye, everyone.
We are so glad you've joined us in the church library today. This is Marissa Franksbert
and Kelsey Kramer McGinnis. And if you liked what you heard here, we think you'll be interested in reading our forthcoming book, The Myth of Good Christian Parenting: How False Promises Betrayed a Generation of Evangelical Families.
You can pre-order it now wherever books are sold, and it'll be on shelves in October of 2025.